Good morning. I'm here with Shaun Mader, who is the founder and CEO of Trusted Leadership. Good morning, Shaun.
Good morning. Great to be with you.
Absolutely. I'm glad that you showed up, that you're back after the last virtual event that we did. Appreciate that.
Oh, my pleasure.
Good. So tell me just a little bit about your background and your company.
I don't want to be repetitive if people were on the last one, but I will give a little bit of background. So, I work with executives and teams on leadership development, cultivating trust, hence the name Trusted Leadership. But as we talked about last time, the pathway to that was a little bit nonlinear. I used to be a photographer, and I used to work with a lot of underrepresented communities where I often had to create trust in really unorthodox circumstances. And I had a parallel life to that, leading large transformational leadership programs to people from all walks of life, including a lot of executives. And one of the pieces that really provided back then was seeing that our transformation of our cultures and work is really a personal transformation. And the results we produce at work are not separate from how we do things in our lives. So it was really a privilege at the time to work with people from all walks of life and even have executives mixed in with people. And when I began coaching executives, I sometimes worried that I didn't know enough about their particular industries. And yet they insisted on bringing me in. And of course, every time I got into a situation, it turned out the breakdown was interpersonal. It was the way people saw a situation, saw the other person, or saw themselves. And there was always a mismatch, and that led to the breakdown. So the breakdown was never really about the technological solution itself or the particular thing. Once you resolve the interpersonal piece, all those other things got sorted out. So that's where I've tended to focus. So when I do strategy and leadership development, we remove those obstacles first, and then everything else seems to flow better.
Yes, so we've had some great conversations and we met through a networking organization. And one of the topics that we talked about, so I work for IQ Nexion. We're a digital marketing agency doing website and design. And as such, we have millennials, Gen Z, but then we also have baby boomers. You and I have had conversations about the generational divide.
Yeah.
Certainly, manufacturers are dealing with that now as a lot of boomers are retiring. One of the things that you shared with me was something called fourth wave, and you shared with me a slide, and I think it would be helpful for the viewers today if you could walk us through that slide and maybe talk about how that can provide a perspective to help leaders, manufacturers work their way through some of the things that they're challenged with today with
Yeah.
the multi-general workforce.
Yeah. And I think that some of that came from us talking about how a lot of this conversation gets bogged down in a lot of views about, oh, this is how Gen Z is, or that I'm in a lot of human resources groups, leadership groups. These are all dealt with. These are a whole mosaic of problems that need to be solved. And if I was in a leadership role at one of these companies, absorbing that conversation, I think I'd be very overwhelmed and very frustrated. And I just thought this slide really brought a different perspective on things. So let's put this up here just so everybody can see it. And we're going to walk through it a little bit.
So one
This
second
is
before
from,
you pull, sorry, Shaun, before you pull that up. So it's interesting because my daughters are millennials, and the whole thing. I work on the board of an organization, and a lot of times we put groups, age groups, into these certain categories.
yeah,
And I know millennials don't like being called millennials, and Gen Z and whatever, everything else. There's a certain reality, I think, to characteristics, perhaps, but these are really people problems and challenges, and putting people in a category. I don't want to get on a soapbox, but if you want to comment on that, I'll give you an opening.
so I think about this a lot because to talk about millions of people as if they're one homogenous group with no respect to their backgrounds, their influences. These titles only work up until a point, and then people do start to feel like you're just treating them like some stereotype, and nobody likes to be treated like a stereotype. Why do I need to be here if I'm just some placeholder for you or something like that? But that said, hey, generational differences obviously exist. And by the way, some of the interplay on this can be good-hearted ribbing. I think people can even bond over some of their cultural, their generational differences. But the reality is every generation was born into a set of historical, economic, socio circumstances that they interacted with during those prime years of life that gave rise to a particular worldview that was related to what was going on at that time. So if you were born in the late or the 50s and you suddenly came of age with Vietnam and the hippie revolution, everything that you think and see about the world is going to be forged in some of that kind of mold. We are now seeing larger gaps between generations because of the accelerations of technology, the interconnection of the world. What people are exposed to is vastly different. So when one group tries to impose their lens of life on another, we're rarely ever having a mutual conversation. And I think that has accounted for a lot of the miscommunications, the frustrations, and a lot of the kind of cheap stereotyping. Because we know the stereotypes. So Gen Z, they're entitled, they're this, they're that. They don't want to work. They want, not when you talk to them. And so I
Not what
thought this
I've
slide actually,
experienced.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
our workers, they're the millennial Gen Z, they're some of the hardest workers that we have.
Yeah. We have to remember they're also the future. And their ability to have assimilated so much, I would say this younger generation has so much more coming at them and has assimilated so much more that they have a nascent understanding of things that is rather sophisticated. It's definitely more sophisticated than when I was a kid. And I don't want to speak for other generations, but it's like they got a much higher level computer processor for a brain. And they're facing challenges that other generations have not had too. So this is not a one is better than the other. I think you find, and hopefully by the end of this conversation, we'll actually start to see that there's a real opportunity here to bring these together in a collaborative way that can really bridge these gaps.
That's great background and a good segue.
Yeah. Why don't I put this slide up just so that people can, we don't want to keep the mystery from them for too long here. But this is a table from a book called The Fourth Wave, The Role of Business in the 21st Century. And what you're looking at here is the dimensions of the corporate role in society. And so as you look at this, you'll start to see an evolution over a timeline moving from the second wave to the fourth wave. So as you read along, I think what you can start to see is that it could generally be said that where we are right now in history is attempting to transition from the second wave to the third wave. Now, the reason I love this slide is that I think leaders, HR departments, people trying to address a lot of the issues in the workplace are underneath an avalanche of different topics and terminology. You could be talking everything from competition for talent to employee engagement, retention, learning and development, getting the right team dynamics, DEI, CSR, ESG, how you're developing people to be competitive in the future. That can really all start to pile up. And if you deal with these as individual symptoms, you'll never get at the root cause. So looking at this slide, what we have seen from a lot of interviews, a lot of just personal conversations with people, the second wave was appropriate for companies up until recently. And if we look at the history of our, say, our corporate world, our factories, our manufacturing, The structures that we use are an outgrowth of our successes in World War II. It was the first time we deployed resources and personnel in such a sophisticated way and then came back with huge successes. That structure, there's a lot of generals and people from the military that were put into manufacturing companies because they knew how to do top-down command and control operations. And that gets you certain results. It gets you so far. But as like any system that evolves over time, it gets more sophisticated. There are more pieces. Look at our digital world now is just breathtaking in its complexity compared to 40 years ago. So now there's an evolution in the role of the organization. And this generation is really having to confront some of the existential challenges like ecological destruction, global warming. You have young people who think these are the last days of democracy. You have every generation has looked at the generations behind them and said, you know, what you told us didn't really pan out the way you said it was. You have a lot of young people saddled with debt. They feel like they're being exploited at every turn by companies who want to fool them with one thing and give them another. There's a whole lot of things going on. And what I find more and more now is that younger people intuitively are being born with the understanding that the third wave outlook is obvious. It's what's needed. And I think this is most important. It's what makes best business. So one way, I hear this a lot, so I'm going to sum up what I hear from a lot of people. A lot of conflicts that happen in companies that drive a lot of unsatisfied employees is young people who are clear that this third wave perspective is superior. It leads to better human outcomes, societal outcomes, and business outcomes. Feel like they're being asked to operate in a second wave paradigm. And so you can maybe start to appreciate how they feel like it pulls at every fiber of their being. Not only is this bad for business, it's bad for people, it's bad for communities. So this little piece here, I think we could go really deep into. But if you look at it from a societal level, deep down, everybody wants to make a difference. Deep down, everybody wants their lives to have some sort of value, and they want to experience themselves making a contribution. I would say that impulse is even more so now. I think of this impulse to want to have a life that's contributing to solutions in the world has grown in proportion to the level of the crises we're facing. And what I hear from a lot of young people is they're almost in an existential crisis. And then they're dealing just with financial stresses and trying to make things happen and all of that. So here's what if you're a leader, just getting present to this. One of the things I think that's really important is to tune into, well, what is the conversation in our organization about this? How are we talking about, it could be Gen Z, millennials, it could be whatever, but what are the assumptions that we're making? What are the judgments that we've already made? I think if you start to listen there, you'll start to see that the situation has been framed up in a particular kind of way, where this is a chore, we're trying to kowtow or just please. It's not. I think when you actually start talking with young people, no, they want to have a new kind of agreement about what it looks like to operate in a modern age. They actually want to be connected. They want to be solving problems. They do not want to have somebody who they don't think gets what's going on in the world, micromanaging them and criticizing them and talking down to them like they're dumb. If that's what you've got for a manager, no wonder people are quitting. No wonder so I'm not saying that's every situation, obviously, but it's a sentiment that is widespread out there. And I find this is really a matter of miscommunication. So first, looking, what is the conversation? What are some of the assumptions? And I think obviously I want to get to solutions here. There is so much room for collaboration. I met a woman who was 64 years old who had just started a new career, started a new office space, and she's surrounded by young people. And so I was so curious to ask her about her experience and all of this stuff. And she was really fortunate. She worked in a great environment. And I think she just had a predisposition that and it was really remarkable because she said, oh, yeah, no, this generational thing. She's, look, it's actually been amazing. I'm challenged with things like technology. How do I sync up my new phone? Or we got all this new software. She said, I've never used some of this software. The young people, they've just been so amazing. I asked them, they show me, and I got my own learning curve. But as we get to know each other, they start bringing me questions about life and relationships and how do I advance? What would I do for my career here? And she's now I look at them like they're my children. And we have this amazing thing. And I think that's what gets overlooked here is when we have viewed each group with such judgment, both people would naturally get defensive, self-righteous. I'm going to show you why we're better than you. And it all breaks down. But when we can start to see that every generation has something really valuable to offer and leadership can be at the head of that conversation and start to facilitate these kinds of conversations, young people are desperate for answers to some of the bigger things in life. Older people could learn a few things from them too. Nobody's perfect. Nobody's got to figure it out. And nobody's the boogeyman here. Inside of that, for me, I think there is really an opportunity to take a lot of tension out of the space and just have conversations. And people will tell you what's important to them if given an authentic space to voice that.
Yeah, I think it can be intimidating as an older person. The fact that you mentioned that the technology and everything that kind of the younger workforce has at their fingertips, things that they've been exposed to, it may come easier to them. Certainly, again, that kind of and I'm sure it's intimidating going the other way. Here's someone that has a lot of kind of work experience or thinks they have a lot of work experience. So I think you may have touched on a few of these things, but if organizations don't adopt this third wave model when the younger workforce is expecting that, what are some of the challenges that organizations will face if they don't rise to meet that challenge?
First thing is I think you're going to see a lot more of the same. You're going to see this just continuous churn of people, this kind of sense that they're disaffected, the fact that they don't want to work. I think people will continue to experience that. Even longer term, look, we have an accelerated churn rate on the S&P 500. The lifespan of a company in the S&P 500 has gotten, it's about the third of the length that it used to be 50 years ago. There's real ramifications for the survivability of an organization that doesn't know how to adapt as things are changing. Leaders need to be developing their people to be collaborative, curious, innovative. How do you actually go through a fast changing environment and come up with prototypes and ideas and quickly test? And I mean, this is the kind of creative work people really want to do. And if it's all stuck in, no, this is how we've always done it. I showed this slide to a bunch of MBA students at Fordham. And I had them look at it and said, what skill sets and ways of being are required in the third wave that weren't necessarily required in the second wave? And it was really interesting to watch them mull it over, because they said, oh, I'm going to pull it right back up here. If you're out to create value versus just maximize profits, or you're also attempting to help solve social problems, or the values of creating value, trust, and learning, or you want to spread it out, your stakeholders are now your customers and your communities and governments and going beyond that. Oh, This is about collaboration. This is about building relationships. This is about empathy. This is about getting ideas from other people from outside your domain. This is about knowing how to play with ideas and mix things up or get creative. Now, though, that's a very, when we talk about upskilling people, we tend to talk about all those like we call them soft skills. I think we need to do a rebranding campaign on that. These are power skills. These are the skills that are required to navigate the future and remain competitive. So when young people inherently and intuitively understand that, and then they're thrust into an environment where that stuff is scoffed at or being told that's dumb, or they're being entitled to think that, it's so demoralizing because they're watching people tell them, no, do it this way, even though they think that way is destructive, unwise, and unprofitable. So what I think is really at the root of this, though, is once you get an understanding of, okay, this is the direction we need to move, the next question becomes how. And that's a really legitimate concern because, look, if people knew how to do things, they would have done it already. And oftentimes people will resort to what they know best because they can't envision a new pathway. I'm a real strong proponent that there are many pathways. It's just going to be more exploratory. It's going to be collaborative. It's going to be in a conversation. But there's ways to get this very specific and on the court and measurable. And I think that holds a lot of promise to not only appeal to the younger generation, but to give older generations a real pathway forward to make a huge contribution and feel vital and part of the solution themselves.
I like that you talked about skills. In any organization, there are many different skills that need to be learned. These soft skills sometimes can be the most challenging.
Yeah.
So, what other challenges are there to implementing this third wave point of view? And what other skills are needed?
Yeah. So I think that our things like compliance and technical training obviously are always going to get top billing, right? That's just how that goes. I'm probably in a group of people who've been banging that drum for these power skills. I'm going to keep the rebranding campaign going here, the power skills. They're harder to tie to direct outcomes, or it's not a compliance issue. It's not required by OSHA or something like that. So this has to be the leaders insisting on it. There are enough metrics out there to make a case, but really I think leadership needs to see the value. Now, how to do that becomes another challenge. A lot of our continued learning in organizations has become defined by the technology available. We all have these LMSs with a bunch of online courses, and now you can tap into huge libraries of endless courses. Challenge is a lot of these courses are designed to just give you a bunch of tips and tricks. And then people are told you have to complete X, Y, and Z. So people just sit there and they watch their videos. There's no retention. There's no engagement. There's no implementation. For these kind of skill sets, we follow this progression: be, know, do. You actually have to learn how to be it. And then you start to implement it. That requires a different format of learning. And so that's some of the things that I'm engaged with a lot of people on. It's something that I'm working with some of the people at Barry Waymiller on, how to roll out this kind of learning. And we call it collaborative cohort-based learning. You give people structures and frameworks where they go to work on their actual work, looking at it with new questions and new ways of engaging, so that they're figuring it out. They're collaborating along the way. They're figuring out problems together. They're learning the key concepts, but not at the intellectual level. They've actually learned how to practice it, and they walk out of there with the kinds of relationships and relatability with each other, knowing that, oh, we just practice this here. Now, when a future circumstance comes up, we actually know how to do this together. That is a form of learning that honestly is it requires humans. And as just a little aside to this, you can't go anywhere without talking about AI. AI is going to do great things for certain aspects of our business. And I'm sure in the manufacturing space, the way it's going to be able to automate or connect sensors and do all of these things. My personal experiences is that we avoid the messiness of human beings and really hope that the next round of technology will be able to somehow magically take care of it. And it never does. With good facilitation, this stuff becomes actually a wellspring of where real potential can be actualized. I think AI has the potential to highlight what human beings are exceptionally good at and clarify that for us so that ultimately, if we double down on human beings, we're going to find that's where the real value gets unlocked. The technology will be a piece of it, but it's going to be how we develop our human beings to make them more human. That's going to be, and again, I know that's a pretty broad statement. That sounds a little amorphous, but it really does get executed in these kinds of conversations and structures where people discover it, they embody it, you see their interactions changing, the way the conversations go, the actions that come from that, those yield very different outcomes.
You read my mind. I was actually going to ask you about the role of AI, so you're a step ahead of me. But it's
yeah, it's a big topic, but it's so novel. It's going to be so life changing. But my real hope is that it actually. Look, I'm a humanist, so I can't help. Maybe I'm biased.
yeah. Well,
I think getting people more and more attuned to these ways of working is going to be a win for everybody. It's going to be more profitable for leaders. It's going to be more enjoyable as human beings. They're going to be engaged in work that is far more interesting and exploratory, and it's going to help them. It's going to take some of the burden off of them having to have had to function like computers and cogs for those previous generations. I think there's some real potential to unleash here.
just to wrap up. I think one of the things that you mentioned in the last few minutes was, and I think you mentioned it in the last virtual event that we did, is that going through the process that you walk people through, it's that self-realization has a lot of power to it and gives them the kind of reflexes you mentioned a few minutes ago they take those things that they learn and it becomes reflexive so that they can deal with a situation. I don't know if you want to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah. So what we find a lot of times is people get hired into a workplace. They're walking into an inherited culture. Like you get a new job, you go into a place, you start scanning the area, you try to figure out how do they do things here? How am I going to A, be successful, or B, stay out of trouble? And without knowing it, an organization has a lot of tacit agreements. This is how we operate. This is how we do things. And no matter what your background is, you tend to assimilate to whatever the status quo is. Most people who want to rabble rouse and start a lot of new stuff, they don't last very long. That's typically how it goes. What we find in a lot of situations is it's not that people are lacking the ability or lacking the capacity. It's just that they have never been asked the right questions. They've never been given the space to consider something new, or they don't trust that if we do come up with something new, that it's going to be heard. We walk people through, and we use a few different tools. We've talked about the optimal trust one, but how do you engage people to begin to think about things differently and have that result in new ideas that they can take actions on? And a lot of it is just engaging them in questions they haven't asked or before or been given the room to consider. They haven't done it in a facilitated way where they got to go through a series of steps where, oh, after 5 or 6 steps, we're in a very different place here. So again, that is the kind of stuff AI is never going to really get you to. And I think there's a lot of room, both at the interpersonal and cultural level, and what it takes to create. We think of innovation in terms of tech. I'm talking about innovation in terms of process and how people get together and the things that they come up with that are going to improve how a company functions, whether it's optimizing and streamlining processes between departments and silos. That could save you millions of dollars right there, or a new product offering because you got your people thinking more humanistically and they're more tuned into the customer. It can really cover a wide spectrum depending on where you want to take things.
It's interesting. That kind of led to, okay, the new employee, and this is the environment I've now been thrust into. But it also works the other way. So how do you create that open environment where that new employee or your younger team members can bubble up their feedback up to
Yeah.
management?
Yeah. So this is a really great question. And I've seen a few different things being done here. First, you'd want to think of your employees like customers. We think of an onboarding process. We think of well, a lot of times we end up looking at the onboarding process for companies. Do your new hires actually understand your values? Are they coming through a pipeline that demonstrates how, like, what does it look like to work here and what's being encouraged? Are they getting access to bonding and connecting with mentorship? There's simple things like this along the way that make huge differences. And as you start to get up to those other levels, well, how do these things maintained? Are you checking in with your people along the way to see how we're doing? A lot of times they only interview people on their exit after they've already left, after you've lost out on your investment. What about checking with your new employees 6 months in? So when we talk about how do you create these ecosystems, it's also what structures do you have in place to engage people differently? Are you making the conversation loud and clear from a communications level that, hey, we're doing this with an intention here? I think everybody appreciates that we all get stuck in our routines. So how do we break that up from time to time? So a lot of this is looking at this. The structures can actually be figured out organically, surprisingly. A lot of it comes down to the communication. How are these values being transmitted? And so there's a book I love called The Idea-Driven Organization. And it talks about how do you empower frontline innovation. And one of the most innovative companies is a canning facility from Brazil. Big surprise to me as well. Wouldn't have thought. And they have a system for idea submission. And there's different idea submission softwares out there. And some of them are deployed well and some of them aren't. But if you look at that company down there, how is it that your frontline workers are figuring out things that are saving tons of broken product and this and that? How is it that a company like that has its people engaged? So again, it can absolutely be done. I just happen to be fortunate that I do a little work with Barry Waymiller, who I think is a role model for this kind of work in the world. And we're actively trying to get that word out too. Because again, why not have people be happier, make more profits, have people stick around longer, and, generally have a better time at it.
Shaun, I want to thank you for your time today. It's great to have you back again, and look forward to maybe some future events that we can do together.
I always appreciate it, Eric. Thanks for having me.
Great. Thank you.